are big issues for the government, and it makes it a serious concern for the government. Now, I want to talk about social theory for one moment. I know not all of you are sociologists, so I've simplified it, and I'll make it brief, and we can talk about it more in the Q&A if people are interested. But in terms of social theory, one of the social theory can be simplified into theorists falling into two different camps when they try to understand the informal economy. One camp is what I call the neoliberal thesis. And these folks basically say that it's about, both of them say it's about capacity, state capacity. So the neoliberals say the state passes all these laws and make it really complicated for you to go out and start a business or for you to hire workers, and they don't have the capacity to enforce all those laws. So what happens is people end up just skipping over the laws and starting the business without following the laws, and so they end up in the informal economy. And so they argue that if you have less regulation, then there's less of an incentive to skip into the informal economy. So less regulation will shrink the informal economy. On the other side is what I call the marginalization thesis, and these folks say that the informal economy is this inevitable product of uneven development. And as countries become more developed and their capacity to regulate grows, they can regulate the economy, and people it will grow. The formal economy will grow. So right now in these countries that are less developed, there's big informal economies, and these informal economies rely on things like trust and social networks, and those are all transactional costs. Those all raise the cost of doing business. And if the government can regulate it, the laws will allow people to move into the formal economy rather than having to rely on the informal economy. So they argue that actually more government regulation will help people move into the formal economy. So they come up with opposite conclusions in terms of the relationship between the state and the informal economy. There's also a third stance which caught my interest, which is an argument that it's not about state capacity, that it's about state tolerance, and that the state actually, in some cases, tolerates the informal economy and may actually encourage the informal economy to grow. And in other cases, they might decide they don't want to tolerate it, and they discourage it from growing. This makes a lot of sense. But given the fact that I've just given you good reasons why the state should be concerned about a large formal economy, social instability, why would they tolerate the growth of the informal economy? Well, in Latin America, it's been suggested that the informal economy also, in certain cases, can contribute to political stability and economic viability. So it seems like the states are walking a tightrope, right? If there's no informal economy, the informal economy becomes some sort of a social network, a social net. So if there's not jobs, if people don't have jobs, they don't have a way to make a living, the informal economy is a backup plan. And if the state clamps down on that, they don't have that, right? And it can end up in protest. So it needs to allow that some extent of an informal market. But if it gets too big and there's too many workers in the informal economy and the wages and working conditions are too bad, then they might end up with social instability. So it seems like the state has to balance both ends of the extreme there. And then it's been suggested that in liberal democracies like the United States and Europe, that in these places the state tolerates the illegal immigrants and the informal economy because they have moral and legalistic restrictions that force them into that position. Now, in the face of the draconian laws that we've recently seen passed in places like Arizona, I think it definitely calls into question this thesis, but it's been put forth as an explanation for why the state might tolerate the informal economy in places like America and Europe. But really what I want to focus on is this issue of state tolerance in China, and because I think it does make a lot of sense that the way that state tolerance operates in China, it will influence the shape of the informal market that I saw and the differences. So different types of state tolerance, different levels, more or less state tolerance might shape explaining the very different configurations that I saw. But when I looked at the literature, there were some issues and problems with this concept of state tolerance. So my goal is to tweak it and so that it can become useful to me in understanding the informal economy. So one of the problems that I noticed was that most studies on the informal labor markets and the informal economy are national level studies, and so they conceptualize the state on the national level. But I would like to reconceptualize this notion as and to reconceptualize the state as existing on local and national levels, and to take serious the suggestion that sometimes the national and the local state can be at conflict in terms of and at odds with each other in terms of their goals and the ways in which they regulate various phenomena. So it needs to be reconceptualized on these different levels. And so I've decided to study it, the informal economy and state tolerance in 3 different cities in China. I chose Beijing. Beijing as a measuring stick. It's the political capital and the national capital of China. And my thesis is that state tolerance will look similar to what it looks like on the national level, right? We would expect Beijing to sort of match up with what's happening on the national level. And then I chose Nanjing and Wuhan, and I chose these 2 different cities because they're what's called second-tier cities. And second-tier cities are where most of the people in China live, but they're not studied very much. We don't hear about these cities, even though they're the most populous in terms of where people live. So it's good to know about them. And Nanjing is the capital of Jiangsu province, and Wuhan is the capital of Hubei province. So they're both capital cities, and one province is on the east and one's the central. So that's another variation. And finally, the percentages you see here are the percentage of the population in each city which are migrants. So 25% of the population in Beijing are migrants, 31% in Nanjing, and 19% in Wuhan. And Wuhan is unique in the sense, or different from Nanjing in the sense that it's both a sending and a receiving city. So in terms of migrants, so that's important to keep in mind as we move forward. And the second tweak I want to add to this concept of state tolerance is that a lot of the studies when they do mention state tolerance, they make claims about it, but nobody's actually measured it. And there's no real solid data behind these claims. So if I'm going to make claims about the way in which state tolerance influences the informal economy, I want to be able to measure it and have data to back up those claims. So I want to operationalize it, collect data, and then be able to make solid claims with data behind them about state tolerance. So the data that I plan on and collecting on state tolerance is data on the laws, and I have some preliminary data to present today on that, and data on newspapers. And the reason newspapers, both laws and newspapers are quite different than here in America. For those of you who are not from China or don't know much about China, laws are more dictates. They're not passed by well, they are sometimes passed by something similar to what we have in the terms of the Congress, but it's a very different process. The actual process it goes through is very different than here in America. So laws are, as I said, much more of a dictate than going through a democratic process in which it gets passed or gets held up in gridlock, depending on when you're in America. And newspapers are not, they are considered to give you the perspective of the state. So in the United States, in theory, our newspapers are offer us a different perspective from the state. It might be a corporate perspective, but it is different from the state. But in China, most people agree that the newspaper represents the state attitude. So if you want to measure state attitudes, newspapers would be a good instrument to do that. And then also we'll be collecting interview data, which we haven't done. We'll do it this summer. So these are the